Welcome to What's Left, a weekly political discussion challenging the mainstream left. I'm Eduardo here from Mexico City with co-host teacher and socialist Annie Lipson, all the way from Oakland, California. We are online at whatsleftpodcast.com. You can find that link to our site, the episode notes. You can also find my personal social media handle as at Don Eduardo Abarca. Please subscribe, rate, review, turn on your notifications, and share your favorite episode wherever you found this episode. We have merch as well. If you fancy a shirt, contact us through our site at whatsleftpodcast.com. Thank you. All right, Andy, why don't you introduce the topic for today, since it was your idea?
Yeah. So we're talking about DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And the reason I wanted to talk about it is, there was that whole thing that happened with the plane coming into Washington, D.C., and the helicopter being flown by a newer pilot, a woman through the military, and they collided, killing everyone, which was awful. Like they were trying to land, like that would, it's very like upsetting to even think about it. But I remember, well, my mom sent me an article about it, and I know that Trump basically said the magic letters DEI as an partial explanation for why such an accident would happen. And then of course you kind of get on one side, it's like, yeah, thank God he's saying that. Like his base just gets animated by it. The other side gets like revolted and outraged that how dare he. And it really made me think about, it forced me to ask myself, which I've been thinking about for quite some time since we started What's Left, not just what do I think about DEI. I don't think I agree with DEI. I think I don't. But I think it's a different reason than the people who oppose DEI from Trump and those folks. But also, I think it means I have to ask myself, what do I think about affirmative action? And I don't think I support affirmative action. And so I want to talk about that. And we can start from anywhere you want to. And I want to say that I do believe all sorts of divisions exist in society. Racial divisions, national divisions, gender divisions, sexual orientation divisions, political divisions, and those divisions are created and amplified by the capitalist class and by their state. So the capitalist state that we live underneath is a ruling class that lives on part by sowing divisions among us. So I do believe that racism exists, sexism. It's not a question of those things. Of course they exist because those are some of the divisions that are used for the capitalists to stay in power. But the question is how do you respond then to all these things? Because affirmative action and DEI in part acknowledge those divisions, but it's the state essentially saying, here's what we're going to do to ameliorate some of those divisions. And for most of my political life as a leftist, I would have said these things don't go far enough, but there are reforms that I support. And I no longer feel that way. I don't support these reforms. I think I have a difficult relationship with reforms in general. So that's an issue as well. Maybe that's the discussion, but I'll use this as one way of talking about it. I think that when you allow the state to come in and say, okay, yeah, we got some problems here. Here's our solution. You are setting yourself up for some mischief. And I don't think any revolutionary who wants to fundamentally change the system should not fall for supporting that sort of thing. I think it's possible to acknowledge the divisions, to acknowledge the inequality, and still say, no, affirmative action is just affirmative action or DEI are just state-run salves that, far from actually solving the problem, they do much more to obscure it than solve it. And there's a few ways I think that obfuscation works. It gives the U.S. its veneer of equity and and democracy that it uses to project its imperial project into other countries, into Africa, into South America. So they use affirmative action or DEI, saying, look how far we've come. Look at our equal society or more equal society. And it becomes the basis, and particularly for liberals, who currently they're the ones who really seem to be loving going into all these wars, to justify liberal imperialism. And secondly, it really becomes a way that the ruling class essentially becomes both, as it perpetuates the divisions, workers look a section of the ruling class to heal it, to make those divisions go away. And those divisions cannot be those divisions can never be taken away by the state. They will only be amplified. They can only be taken away by actual struggle against the state, not the capitalists themselves. It's the act of collective struggle that teaches the working class to address its divisions. So this is just an opening statement about that. And last thing I'll say is, now that we're in the era of Trump and the conservatives, or the Republicans are in power, I also see how what DEI implementation sows divisions, but then it also allows a section of the ruling class to oppose DEI and use those magic letters to gain workers to their side. And again, say, well, we're the one who. So that thing that was creating new divisions, we're going to oppose that. So come and join us. So it's a very interesting game of pro DEI Democrats or liberals say they're trying to do something about racism and inequality. They're actually, even if they don't think they are, you are increasing divisions and increasing inequality under the pretext of solving it or mitigating it. They don't say solve, they say mitigate. And then another section of that same ruling class that benefits from sowing divisions gets to speak to another section of the working class that hates being told how to think and what to do, and sees it as a threat to them, and say, oh, come over to our side. And all I have to do is say these magic letters DEI, as Trump did with this plane thing, which I don't think it's a DEI thing. Do I think it's an experienced pilot thing? Yes. But I think the biggest thing, it looks to me like it was an overtaxed air traffic controller, along with, it looks to me like the military should not be flying their helicopters in that region, in a zone that has planes there. That to me is like, and then I heard that there's a night vision goggle thing, like they were wearing night vision goggles so you couldn't see things and blah, blah, blah. But there's a lot, like any airplane crash, there's a lot of instances of why it happens. And you'll also note that since that airplane crash, there have been 2 subsequent airplane crashes, and no one's talked about DEI, probably because in those cases, it was maybe an experienced person or a male. So we don't bring up DEI. So in many ways, there's truths on both sides, if you will, but both sides are lying. Both sides are using half truths to promote a lie that they are attempting to act on the behalf of some section of the working class. But it's an interesting trick the capitalists have pulled off with DEI. That's kind of what got me thinking about this, to be able to keep workers, inhabiting either the Democratic Party to deal with racism, or to go under go with the Republicans to do something about the plight of workers. The male worker or the white worker or just average Joe kind of thing. So the Republicans aren't doing that. They're not interested in that. They're interested in smashing the working class here. The Democrats are interested in smashing the working class both here and abroad, as the Republicans are. But they get to play these games with things like DEI and affirmative action by virtue of this. And so I've been thinking, it has caused me to think more deeply about my own belief in those, and even in the belief of a partial reform that addresses some kind of injustice. No, I don't think you. I now believe it's, well, at least in this regard, on this issue, it's all or nothing. You're taking on capitalism. You're taking on the capitalist state. You're taking on the capitalist class. It is the act of workers. The only way that can be done is workers joining together they will have to resolve their differences through the process of working together. You cannot get DEI training from above, from a corporation, to make that happen. In fact, if you do that, you are going to sow more divisions. And so the only way I believe that divisions get solved is in struggle, in the heat of battle, if you will. And the reality is there's very little battle here. So DEI is really just top down head fixing. That actually does other things as well. Basically making it so that white workers, if they have a black manager or a woman manager and they oppose that person, it's not you standing up for your workers' rights. It's you're racist or you're sexist. It provides that opportunity for those divisions, for them to use those kinds of labels or those kinds of terms to mitigate resistance from workers. That's one thing I see on the liberal end, and I've experienced that in my workplace. And so I guess I wanted to start there.
You have said a lot.
Should I cut that down more, or was that
No,
fine?
that's fine.
Okay.
So we did an episode on identity politics back in 2018, I think it was. And we are revisiting this topic in a different way, looking at it on the criticism, I believe, on the right rather than on the left, as we had discussed over the phone, because I was trying to figure out what angle to look at this from, because I thought we had already covered this. And yes, so I also think, similarly to you, that in a capitalist society, these are the way that the identities are used to pit workers against each other. And of course, as you have also said, divisions naturally do exist. We are different in many ways, by race, by skin color, by different ways of being. We just are different, right? Even just our cultures. And naturally, I think I read some study a long time ago that people tend to feel most comfortable around other people that are similar to them. That's just a natural instinct. Uh, they tend to trust people who speak the same language. People tend to trust others if they look similarly, if they come from similar backgrounds, etc., etc., etc. Deaf people will trust other deaf people rather than hearing people because they just don't know what's happening out in the hearing world, right? It's just, or uh, if you speak English and you're in a foreign country and you don't speak the other language, you just tend to trust another tourist who just speaks the same language as you do because you're from the same country. It just happens to be that way. And yes, I have a lot of issues with DI because of my own experience. I'm Latino. I'm um, uh, also differently. Like my sexuality is manifested in different ways, from having dated women, men, and what else? I'm considered a brown person in identity politics. Like I'm just, this is the stuff that I have been fed into, and U.S. American woke culture, liberal culture. I'm quite aware of what my identities are. I think I'm more aware of it when other people make it aware, make me aware of it. I have said this before, but why I think it's an issue and I have a criticism is because I have seen in my own workplace and in other fields diversity training being pushed onto uh, um, the workforce, or to pushed onto people to take. And I have seen people feign or pretend to take this on, and I don't find it to be authentic.
Yep.
And so I don't find these things to work. And I have been looking into of some studies, and a lot of the studies point out that a lot of the diversity training in big companies just don't have any positive effects on underrepresented groups like Black or Hispanic folk. Well, I think it's because of the nature of its competitive state. You're in a company, you're in a capitalist society, and like you said, I think the real understanding of one another is in that work of struggle, of looking for each other and finding solidarity to build something, to work together. I have seen this at uh, in public education at my school site, at work, at my nephew's school. When you have uh, Latino families with Black families, with white families, and then you are trying to fight for the same thing. You look beyond your culture, language, and identity, and you try to find that way to bring something to fruition when you are trying to beat the bigger problem here, which is administration or whoever's in charge, and there is a solidarity that's important. So, uh, so that's my problem with this diversity training is that I think it's pushed on by the left, but I don't think it's effective. And even if people pretend to be diverse trained or to be conscientious of people's identities, I've seen it being used in a way that only allows for certain people to speak, as I have experienced myself, to be used when the right voice is being or the right color is being used. And as we have an inside joke, when you have the right Uno cards.
Hmm.
So, uh, so I think that's where it's come from. I think that you're completely right when it comes to Trump trying to take on this, trying to use this for his base. People have felt frustrated, have felt that they don't, they just don't have a voice. They're pushed. Affirmative action. People are speaking about meritocracy. And Trump has touched these sensitive points to the point where he is has garnered support. And I just don't think we'll get anywhere in trying to fight for those, either on the left or the right, uh, push, either for pro DI or anti DI in the political sphere.
Yeah, I mean, it's it's very rich that Trump would say. Basically, Trump gets to, you know, say he's standing up for workers, for the working class, white working class, male working class, maybe that people might think it's that. But in the same, but just by using those magical letters, he can win that support. And what gets completely ignored is a policy of pouring $500 billion into the development of AI. Who do you think's going to, like, working people are going to lose jobs that way? Like, again, and where the tariffs that are going to raise inflation for all workers, and are going to raise prices for all workers. So people's wages are going to be less valuable. So it's it's a kind of a magic spell or magic card he gets to play, just by saying those letters. He can wipe away all the things that he's doing to hurt workers, and people will say, "Oh yeah, he's standing up for us," which it's unfortunate people fall for that. I think you are well. I think the idea. Um, so maybe conservatives would say, "Look, we're fine. We don't need this shit anymore." Um, but the liberals will say, "No, we are not fine. We need this." But their belief, and this is very important, what you're saying, is it must come from above. It must be imposed. It must be put on workers, not coming as a result of workers asking for this, not coming as a result of what workers need, because you would not need your manager and boss doing this if workers wanted it. They would have these discussions of their own. And that's very important, that's where they have to happen. They actually have. If they are imposed, then you can know for a fact that this is not a discussion about racism. It's not a discussion about inequality. It's not a discussion about trying to make the world more equal. It You use the word like like people playing, like, pretending in these meetings. DEI is a giant charade. It's a charade for in those meetings where people will say later, I wasn't going to say anything. Like people will tell me, there's no way I was going to speak up and like I disagreed with some of the things that person was saying, but I'm not saying anything. I might get fired or I would get harassed and da 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 da. And that's then you hear other people who might really agree with it. And like, this is the greatest, but it's not a genuine conversation being had by working class people. It's an imposed thing meant to divide people, and it does that, and also meant to scare people, and meant to make people not as free to speak. And it works. But DEI is a giant charade to put a anti-racist, anti-sexist gloss on the U.S. pig, so that people would say, "Oh, well, the U.S. is not great. It's not completely equal, but it's better than Iran. It's better than Syria. It's better than Russia. It's better than China," and becomes the basis by which people can justify supporting U.S. imperialism on that basis. So that's one of the roles that I really see that it does play, and I think people, the left, I'll say, the left has to stop trying to impose things on workers and remember its roots, which is people don't learn by being told what to think. They learn from their own experience. That's certainly a basic Marxist tenet, and most of these leftists have some level of Marxism. But it really is important that, for better or for worse, I believe revolutionaries have to support workers' self-activity, not anything that's imposed by it. And affirmative action, DEI, are imposed. They are imposed equality. And for that reason, they're fraudulent, because they're being imposed by a state which lives off division. So there's no way that state, in the same way that we know that we don't want to empower the state to control the border, because if it controls the border, then it's going to control us here. You can't let the state get away with saying, "Oh, don't worry, we'll handle inequality. We'll handle racism with our little things we do, affirmative action and DEI, and even quotas or numbers and things like that." You can't let them get away with it. You have to basically say, "No, I reject that. This has to be something put into our hands for us to solve by us dealing with each other." And the last thing I'll say is, it is true that people feel like more comfortable and more, afraid of one another in some ways, and more comfortable with people either look like, or I would say more think like they do. And that will have to be overcome, but that can't be overcome by some imposed ideology. It's going to have to be overcome by a desire for those workers themselves who feel these fears, to say, "Look, what I'm going to have to get over this, because I need those people to make a different world, and so I'm going to have to get to know them." And through that, we will see what kind of solutions come up for the divisions that do exist, because it does have to be solved. It just I believe any revolutionary has to reject a top-down solution or salve.
Yeah, what I'm hearing from you is that we do, or at least this is, let me get this right. Do we agree that there are natural divisions that occur, and how we handle that does not is not going to come from the top down, but rather from us, from working together at the bottom, at the where we're at the same class level.
Right. Where those, and we have to kind of insist on that, like, and it's not going to necessarily work at first, or even work at all per se in the beginning, but it has to be genuinely something that comes from people's desire to address those divisions. It can't be imposed. The minute it's imposed, then they're basically putting both groups in a box and being controlled.
Mhm.
And I think, leftists, because the working class has been um, so inactive, they've kind of just given up on the working class and just said, "Well, I'm just going to tell you what to do," from the left at least. And there's
Yeah,
a counter response from the right to say, "Fuck all that. I'm against all that. I'm going to blame DEI on a plane crash. But there is a there that the thing that the fraudulent nature of it that the opposition to the DEI has in it. They're right. It is a fraud. At the same time, the the notion that you're going to find solidarity with Trump or Musk or Tulsi Gabbard or RFK Jr. is absurd. It's absurd. Like, so they get to kind of like that's that side basically say, oh no, don't go over there. We'll protect you over here with our little plan. And they get over on workers on both sides.
How do I don't know if this fits, but when I was, what was it, a year and a half ago, I forget when I was working with families at my school site, there was a conversation around um, LGBT issues were being discussed around fifth graders and children, and there was a teacher that wanted to have a curriculum imposed onto students and without any parent direction. And it was difficult because on one hand, I do believe obviously that, we should have our sex education. We should have uh, kids share in a confidential or maybe expressive manner if they feel a certain way. But I also felt like parent involvement was very important because of how they were feeling about the curriculum and just hearing them out and what needed to be shared. I didn't think this teacher reached out, had conversations, nor there was any sort of, it was just, we're going to do it this way.
Mm-hmm.
And what I was trying to do was create healthy discussions around what were their fears. What were we doing? And over time, I revealed my own sexuality. And they found it surprising that I was able to have conversations with them where I didn't make them feel families from traditional values, so to speak, people with certain uh, beliefs or brought up with differently with religious beliefs, had an interest in knowing how they felt about their fears and what they wanted and how they shared, and without feeling like they had to repress themselves or speak politically correct, and they can share from their heart. And it changed the way they thought about what being gay or being in a same-sex relationship was, because they had me as just being an example of someone that could hear them out. Whereas most of the people that speak to them, that's what they were doing, uh, were not getting through. And so I think what, if this example makes any sense, it just came to mind, or I have other ones, but uh, it speaks to the fact that people don't, they're not going to do well when they are being imposed on. And I don't think anyone gets it right the first time around. I don't think anyone is going to uh, be able to know exactly how to say it, what to say, and it's inauthentic because they're not able to express freely.
Yeah. Yes. And one thing that I've seen with teachers is often teachers think this is a conversation that they're facilitating in their classroom. And that's not the place where I think this conversation is had effectively because of the power dynamic. I'm essentially a, a person with state power to tell these kids who gets in, who gets out. No, be quiet, sit in your seat, and things like that. But for this conversation to really happen, it has to happen among peers. So this is an adult to an adult conversation. This is, like you said, a teacher to a parent conversation, or a teacher to a teacher, or a parent to a teacher, or just a worker to a worker conversation. And I when I think about the times those have happened, all the conversations I've really had about that have mostly been one-on-one, largely because the level of working class struggle is so low. I mean, it makes sense to me that when I'm having discussions that are more meaningful and honest about race or racism or sex and sexism. It's a one-on-one conversation with another adult, and we get to know where each other stand. Maybe there's a questioning, a pushback, but at the end of the day, we're not looking to break things up. And maybe sometimes there's been situations where I disagree with another teacher about what to do in relationship to a student who can come on a field trip or not come on a field trip. I remember having a discussion about that 2 years ago with a colleague of mine who I really like, and it was a black student, and he's a black teacher, I'm a white teacher, and he and I had a difference of opinion, and we just talked about it. And I ultimately came to say, okay, I can see what you're saying, and this is why we'll deal with it in the way that you're talking about. But that was a very meaningful conversation to me, like, because race and racism came up in that conversation with him. Not my race, he wasn't saying you're being, but here's what the impact of a society which just told this kid he's worthless. Here's why I might want to think about it a little differently, Andy. And I think there were some things that he got me to think about. And ultimately, I ended up dealing with the student in a way that he wanted to be done. And I think things worked out well, actually, in terms of this kid who I didn't particularly trust that much did a pretty good job on the field trip. Not a great job, but a pretty good job. And didn't make it so that other kids, like, we wouldn't be able to go back or something like that. And I wasn't really sure. So that conversation I had with my colleague was way more important to me than any DEI conversation I've had in a faculty meeting. And those are the scales of these things right now. I do believe that the scales are one-on-one, but they are ones where I should be saying what I think is true, and I'm prepared to hear what somebody else is saying is true. If that's going on, then I believe in that. I don't believe in DEI. I don't believe in affirmative action. I don't believe Trump's trying to help workers, any of that stuff. I believe in what regular working people do when they talk to each other or deal with each other. And if it's not that, then I don't want to, I'm not supporting it.
I've had conversations with Black families and Latino families. And on the more personal, more confidential, only in Spanish discussions we've had, they'll sometimes openly admit or say it in a very nuanced way that they just don't trust Black people. And I hear them out, and they just speak about Black people's behavior. And then I speak about the police state and how it's affected us, whether it be immigration police, whether it be back, remind them how police state has made us fearful in Latin American countries, and how it's the same way it's made people fearful here in the USA, where you're at. And when you tie folk around the same struggle, and you identify who's the real issue, then you get together and you have this conversation that doesn't make sense. And the same goes for Black families that I've spoken with that have said, I just don't understand why, their issue is, or what's happening, or, why didn't they get here legally, or, maybe they shouldn't be here, or I don't know. And so we have the same conversation around the police state, and that's the way I have been able to have conversations that are meaningful, where they can both look at the same issue instead of looking at themselves, which is what they're trained to do, and what most people are trained to do, actually. Victims of the same, cult-like behavior from being in the capitalist world. So I that's another example, right? Like, again, having these meaningful conversations. As you say, we're not at a very large, there isn't a worker movement in order for us to have these at a mass, I don't know, working parties, or I don't have one that I can identify with. I still work with small groups myself. I'm looking for my working group here where I'm at.
Me too, actually. So, we're no different.
But speaking to prior experience, that's what either with families and when it comes to public education, or with families when it comes to dealing with the identifying the enemy, the real enemy.
Yeah. And just to say that my belief is that these divisions, which are real and have been promoted by our rulers, they will not be overcome by education, through education. They will not be overcome even in one-on-one conversations. They will ultimately be overcome by people deciding to act together, and through the actions they take together, coming to look at each other differently. That's something I firmly believe, that resolving these differences is not an educational issue, it's an action issue. It's something that people actually have to experience in their bodies through some sort of movement. And so I don't pretend to think that that conversation I have with my colleague is like some sort of adding to the good, adding to the anti-racism in this country. It was just the way I wanted to deal with it with him. But at least it felt authentic. Um, Ultimately, this, in my opinion, any of these divisions will only be overcome by people finally looking at somebody they looked at for groups of people who looked at each other suspiciously for a long time, coming to the conclusion that we need each other to solve this larger problem. So how do we work this out? And then they have to take action together and see if trust is built. And if trust is not built, then the division doesn't get overcome. But that's what I believe in. I believe it's through action, not words or education.
Yeah. I don't have any other. Well, I have another point. Yeah, one last point on
Okay.
my end. You know, I see sometimes political debates from Trump supporters. I try to find. I'm not in the USA to be able to tune in, see what MAGA supporters are thinking, what they're saying. So I have just internet sources just to be able to figure out. And what I hear, maybe anyone in the comments can say it differently, is that they're shut down by being labeled transphobic, racist, you know, um, sexist, and they're stopped. And you were alluding to it from your own experience at your workplace, and I see it as something that's being used, which is why it's so conveniently used by Trump, by Elon Musk, by the people in his administration now. Everyone, Republican senators, even saying DEI, and how Kamala Harris was just a DEI hire. I see it. I see it, and I can understand why, because I have some friends that are white and have said to me, I don't think I can say anything, and that's that's what I think is the appeal, you know,
Yeah.
um, which is understanding and understandable. It's like, don't people will recruit towards, how about having us be all on the same standard? The thing is, they confuse meritocracy and the same standard in the system that we're using currently, because it's not the same. You can't have a same standard in the capitalist world. It's a competitive world. It's a competitive state. You're gonna have to use whatever, like rich people. It's not white people. It's rich people who have um, hiring uh, links or ties, or people who are legacy over people who are rich who go to universities. Admissions aren't actually meant through merit. It's because family, wealthy families being able to contributing to these schools, and that's what's really happening.
Mm.
So anyhow, I thought I'd touch on that because I understand the MAGA base from what I'm hearing, and it could be very frustrating on that side.
Yes. Let me ask this. So I now no longer support affirmative action. I don't support DEI. What about you? Would you say the same things for yourself?
That's like asking me, do I support a president to be? We had like a president to be imprisoned if Trump should be imprisoned, and it's like, of course it should be imprisoned, but so should Obama.
Right.
Affirmative action won't work. Reforms won't work. I've come to understand that over time, especially after 2020. If anyone watches episodes in the past, I had supported a lot of the reforms that I thought were necessary for us to sort of move to a place where more equality, more equity, until we had the right kind of
Right.
movement happen.
And hold on. And what you would say is you knew those were problems, but you were saying we have to kind of at least slow these things down, right? Like I remember what you said, right? Like
Yeah,
we need to have to at least throw some roadblocks in the way of things. So
yeah,
don't stop me from throwing roadblocks in the way. I remember that.
yeah, yeah. I want. I work directly with deaf people, and I work obviously uh, because I'm Latino. I've worked directly with uh, Latinos in the USA, and of course, I want there to be equality. I want there to be equity. But I think those words, those two words, especially because I got a lot of training in them too, during the time that I worked in public education, are used, like I said, for diversity trainings in order to fix a problem that's not fixable. And affirmative action is a nice thing to think about. It is. It's lovely to think that there could be a way that we could consider people with different identities to be able to enter into a university. But university is actually the problem to begin with because it's only used to be able to create more workers in a field that's competitive or in any field that's competitive. And it's not going to fix the issue until we eradicate the issue of uh, the hierarchy that is a system where everyone, in order to have uh, anyone to be at a competitive state, you have to have people you step on, and those people tend to
Right.
be poor people, and
Right.
you're not going to work out this issue by having affirmative action.
Right.
So it's like voting as well. You know, I thought about it a lot of these issues after 2020, and I as much as you one could dream that something could change, things are always going to be set back when you trust in a system that isn't going to work for everyone. So it's like the immigration issue. I'd love for people to go into any place in the world legally, but why don't we just have open borders to begin, like
Right.
as a solution?
Hmm.
And in the same way, I'd love for people, like I said, affirmative action could work. I mean, affirmative action is like a band-aid, but instead of having a band-aid, why don't we heal the whole thing?
Right.
So yeah,
And yeah.
I'm not, to answer your question, yeah, I'm not for affirmative action uh as a solution.
Yeah. And then the other thing is that affirmative action came with Kennedy in relationship, John F. Kennedy, in relationship to a developing civil rights movement that picked up steam more through the middle '60s and early '70s, but looking to head it off of the pass. So it wasn't looking to solve a problem. The problem it was looking to solve was a social movement, not not the issue the social movement was talking about. So that's one of those issues where it's like that social movement, whether it liked it or not, was not going to solve those problems without ultimately confronting the system. And a ruling class takes up something like affirmative action as a means of heading that movement off at the pass and saying, "We got you. We'll take you here. Here's our salve that we're offering," but then ends up using it to promote more divisions.
The only fear I have is that people who look at us and that are folk that are MAGA folk are in agreement with us, but I don't think we're in agreement.
No.
I'm not in agreement with my friend Jake, who thinks we're in agreement. He says, "Oh, me too. I'm not for affirmative action." but your stance or your point of view, the angle that you look at it from, is very different from the way that I see it, because you believe, I don't know how, but there is meritocracy in the system that we are currently living in. It's it's an illusion. It's a fantasy to think that that could happen. There is no such thing as meritocracy either.
Yeah.
There's no
And
such thing as just by your own merits. You can buy your own bootstraps, pull yourself up by your own bootstraps. I think is the expression that you can advance in the world. No one's going to advance in the world in this way. I mean, you have to have poor people naturally. You have to have people at the bottom naturally, and I don't want that kind of world.
yeah, and the idea that I think the position from the right is like, well, we don't have these like, look, we don't have sexism, we don't have racism, we have a black president, we have all sorts of women leaders in corporations and in the military, and you know, they actually use those things as a means of saying, oh, look, it's over, it's not solved, when that was always just pretend, like. And so they say there's no, in a sense, they say there's no reason for a struggle, and they're wrong. Like, the divisions have grown, and struggle ultimately is the only solution to those divisions.
Yeah. Which also brings up, since you brought up affirmative action, reparations, which I have struggled with.
Yeah, yeah.
I don't know. I don't know if I want to get into that hole right now, but maybe we can cut that. But
Yeah,
it's
I mean,
another
I probably
conversation.
will say the same thing about the statements of reparations. Like, any of the reparations I've even seen that have been done for, like, for the Japanese and things like that, have literally just been get out of jail free cards for massive, and they're being and these things are going to be repeated. We're going to have camps again. We're going to have internment. Like, immigrants are being sent to Guantanamo Bay. So it's like, don't act like it's not like we learned any lessons. It's just like, all right, how do I do a payoff to basically say we're all good? So no, I don't believe it. I don't support reparations, because it's not meant to make somebody whole or help somebody. It's meant to keep the system with its legitimacy, and give it kind of like a half-hearted apology for the fucked up stuff it did as it prepares to do it once again. So I say this, when you say you're sorry and you do it again, you're not sorry. Like, you're not. You're you're just saying something to get a person to believe that they should stop bugging you, but you would very much intend on doing all the nasty stuff you were doing before. And the United States is definitely in that ballpark.
So, speaking to whoever's listening to us still, since we've abandoned the left and the right abandoning us as well, don't trust any way
Yeah, that's
of
essentially.
either the left or the right
Yeah,
views of DEI.
yeah. I would say trust the working class. I mean, in a sense, all I'll say is the solution can only be had from below, from workers themselves, and that process is not up for discussion. Like, it's not up for debate. If you don't, if it's imposed somehow, then it's lost.
Yes. Yeah. Right. Anything else you want to add?
That's it.
I think it's the first time I've said I don't agree with affirmative action in my life.
I know. I think it's the first time that I've said it on a podcast. Yeah, I started to think it, but here I am. What am I going to do?
I did say to myself, I don't think I agree with um, reparations to myself. I said it when I was listening to the argument on both sides with Ta-Nehisi Coates, because I read his book.
Yeah.
And I've been afraid to say that. So when you asked me the question, I thought of, that's what it came up to me,
Yeah.
and I thought about reparations. And I thought to myself, if I'm not in agreement for reparations, given the stance that I have, uh, I think then that would apply to affirmative action.
Yeah.
And why am I afraid to say that?
Because people get canceled, and people get, how dare you, like, then some people would be offended, and So I understand. I'm not thrilled. It doesn't fill me with a sense of like confidence, but I feel like that is a true statement. And I appreciate you trying to point out that I think where both of us are coming from, neither is a position, obviously not a position on the left, but it's not a position on the right either.
Hmm.
So, and if people don't understand that, that is what it is. I think we tried our best to explain where we're coming from.
Yeah, I guess the only way I could try to share with some of the lefties that I still linger on my life is I talk about um, um, reforms for incarcerated folk, and I say, well, I'm for abolishing prisons, and I thought that's what Angela Davis was for. So it's not just reforming something here; it's getting rid of the whole thing,
Yeah.
and that's what I'm for. So I don't think why I don't. I guess this is the same applies here. I'm not trying to undermine that there are issues in our system. I'm saying wipe it out, and let's start over, but
Right.
from how we envision that.
Right.
And I think that gets lost, and people use, oh, he's not for affirmative action. He's
Right.
being used by the right.
Right.
Well, that's just the fear.
Actually saying the problems run so deep, they can't be bandaged up. They actually have to be dealt with at the root. And if you don't deal with them at the root, you're not dealing with them.
Right. Yeah. And I think these things have come more solid for me and my personal growth, and looking at the issue of immigration. And after 2020, these things have been more solidified for me.
Yeah.
You can keep that if you want. I think I'm a little bit rambling, but
no,
those are my reflections.
I definitely think it's worth keeping. I'll just say, it's unfortunately we're wrapping up, but I think about where we started What's Left when we kind of started What's Left from the position that you and I were pretty different in terms of how we looked at the left. I see less and less difference between our positions now. It's clearly the show is different. Like we just don't have the friction that we used to have on a number of issues. So, I don't think I wouldn't call you a socialist or a Marxist.
I think
I would call you a revolutionary now. So
drama scars from the past.
Yeah.
You didn't move me. My own people moved me.
They did. No, I see how they did. I appreciate what they did. I don't, but I do.
People look back, stands. No, they did. Trauma scars.
Yeah.
Abandoned me and gave me a different look at this life.
Yep.
All right. Well, that does it for this week's episode. What's Left is a weekly political podcast / channel challenging the mainstream left. We post information about our topics and our guests on the episode notes, wherever you found this episode, or on our blog on Whatsleftpodcast.com. You can find past episodes to this podcast / channel there, and connect with us. I remind folks, if you like anything you've heard here, please subscribe, rate, review, turn on your notifications to any of our platforms on Spotify, iTunes Podcast, BitChute, YouTube, Rumble, or Telegram. You can find our blog and any of those links in the episode notes, wherever you found this episode. If you would like to give us feedback about something that you heard or suggest something for us to cover, contact us through our blog. I'm Eduardo Barca with co-host Andy Lipson, and you can always find my social media handle as @Don Eduardo Barca. Thank you all for listening. Ciao.
Bye-bye.
I was thinking